The air in the Crucible Club was thick, a heavy amber haze of stale scotch, expensive leather conditioning, and the faint metallic scent of ozone that always clung to places where high-tension decisions were made and subsequently drowned in ethanol. This wasn't a public bar. It was a sanctuary built entirely for the brass and the boys who thought they were brass. A velvet-roped cage where rank was supposed to confer immunity, and where power, real or perceived, was the only currency accepted at the door. The soundscape was a low, resonant rumble, the deep thrum of a classic jazz piece, muted laughter that was less about genuine amusement and more about maintaining a certain status, and the clink of ice against heavy crystal. The lighting was unforgivingly dim, designed to flatter the expensive material of a tailored uniform jacket and mask the tired eyes beneath. In the corner, nestled into a banquette that smelled faintly of old cigars and decades of hushed conversations, sat Sergeant Silva. She was an intentional visual anomaly, a study in deliberate mediocrity. Her clothing was simple, civilian, utterly forgettable: charcoal slacks, a dark gray crewneck sweater, devoid of branding or flair. She wore functional, frameless reading glasses perched low on her nose, the lenses catching the dim light only when she dipped her head slightly. Her focus was absolute, fixed on the dense pages of a historical text, something impossibly dry about 19th-century naval logistics. She didn't sip a cocktail. She nursed a glass of sparkling water with a single lime wedge, a conscious decision to remain mentally surgical in a sea of emotional sloppiness. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, practical knot, revealing the sharp, clean lines of a jaw that looked carved from marble. But it was her stillness that was the most profound camouflage. She didn't fidget. She didn't look up. She projected an aura of profound, almost religious disinterest in her surroundings. She was a ghost in the machine, a predator who had chosen to paint herself beige. Across the low, highly polished mahogany table, the atmosphere was different. It was loud, brash, and saturated with unwarranted self-importance. Lieutenant Commander Thorne, a man whose dress whites seemed tailored not just to fit his body but to contain his ego, was holding court. He was physically large, all sharp angles and thick neck, a product of institutional confidence and perhaps a few too many successful but ultimately low-stakes deployments. Thorne was telling a story, punctuated by slaps on the back and bursts of masculine, barking laughter. He wasn't talking to anyone, really, so much as performing for the room. His voice, naturally pitched for projection over the roar of a jet engine or the clatter of a flight deck, cut through the sophisticated hum of the club. He emphasized words with wide, sweeping gestures, oblivious to the proximity of obstacles or people. Silva felt the vibration of his proximity before the visual confirmation. The air pressure shifted slightly as his bulk leaned too far into her space. She registered the scent of his cologne, expensive, aggressive, slightly overwhelming, mixed heavily with the sharp, acidic tang of high-proof liquor. She kept reading. Her eyes tracked the line of text detailing the deployment failures of the Crimean War. Her peripheral vision, however, was mapping the trajectory of his uncontrolled movement. She knew statistically that the collision was imminent. It happened on the climax of his anecdote, a poorly delivered punchline involving a foreign dignitary and a stolen boat. Thorne threw his arm up in dramatic emphasis, the heavy highball glass, filled to the brim with amber liquid, slung carelessly in his hand. The world slowed to a geologic crawl. The elbow hit the corner of her table with a jarring thud. The glass left his grip, tumbling end over end. Silva didn't flinch, didn't gasp. Her eyes remained locked on the word logistics on the page. A sheet of chilled, oily scotch sailed through the air. It didn't just splash, it cascaded. It hit her book first, a sickening, darkening stain spreading instantaneously across the delicate, aged paper of the naval history text, warping the ink and destroying the narrative thread. Then it hit her shoulder, cold and sticky, soaking the sleeve of her simple gray sweater, before pooling momentarily on the polished wood. The noise of the impact, strangely, was absorbed by the heavy atmosphere. It was the sudden cessation of her reading that registered the change in the room. Thorne, initially unaware, finished his laugh. When he finally looked down, realizing his hand was empty and a significant amount of single malt was oxidizing on an innocent bystander, his reaction was not apology, but irritation. "Ah, Christ," he muttered, the tone indicating that the real tragedy was the loss of his drink, not the assault on her person or property. He swayed slightly. the alcohol making his movement sloppy and his judgment non-existent. Silva lowered the book slowly, deliberately, as if she were lowering a casket into the earth. The liquid seeped into the binding. The historical defeat was complete. She removed her reading glasses. The frame of the glasses was thin titanium, cool, precise, engineered. She folded them, the hinge clicking once, sharply, a sound that in the sudden micro-silence felt louder than a gunshot. The movement was economical, zero wasted energy. Without the glasses, her eyes were revealed. They were an unsettling shade of clear, light gray, not blue, not green, but the color of deep winter ice over moving water. They were devoid of warmth, expression, or surprise. They held no judgment, only assessment. The stare wasn't accusatory. It was analytical, the gaze of an auditor counting inventory losses. Thorne, now vaguely annoyed by her lack of frantic reaction, he clearly expected an outburst, a handkerchief, a demand for cleaning compensation, anything to affirm his status as the powerful one, decided to address the situation with the condescension of his rank. "Look, civilian," he slurred slightly, using the term civilian like an epithet. "Bad luck. Expensive jacket. I'll buy you another one or whatever. Go clean up, huh?" He didn't wait for her reply. He reached out with the same large, careless hand that had spilled the drink, intending to brush the wet sleeve dismissively, perhaps even pat her arm, a gesture of patronizing, drunken absolution. This was the critical juncture. The spilling of the drink was an accident enabled by arrogance. The deliberate, uninvited physical contact was a calculated transgression enabled by the assumption of dominance. Thorne's fingers closed around the soft wool of her sweater just above the elbow. His grip was firm, intended to guide her, to move her out of his line of sight like a piece of inconvenient furniture. He squeezed, feeling the delicate bone structure beneath. Silva didn't pull away. She leaned fractionally into the touch. The movement was so small, so deceptively compliant, that Thorne registered nothing amiss. But in that millisecond of apparent submission, Silva's entire musculature, the fine, hyper-trained network of stability and strength that lay dormant beneath the civilian guise, activated. She shifted her center of gravity not by moving her feet, but by subtly engaging her core and transferring her weight fractionally forward. This tiny internal recalibration immediately threw off Thorne's balance, not enough to make him fall, but enough to introduce a micro-vulnerability in his massive structure. Concurrently, her wrist, the one enclosed in his large, hot hand, performed a motion that was balletic in its precision and terrifying in its implications. It was not a struggle. It was a lock. Her thumb moved with the speed of a striking snake, finding the exact nexus of nerves and tendons in the deepest part of his palm, just below the ring finger. Then, her index finger applied reverse pressure on the radial nerve located near the back of his wrist bone. The technique was instantaneous and complete, requiring almost zero exertion on her part. To Thorne, the sensation was catastrophic. It was not mere pain. It was the sudden total collapse of motor function in his entire hand. His grip, which moments before had been a confident vice, instantly vaporized, replaced by a searing electrical agony that traveled straight up his arm. It felt as if every tendon in his hand had simultaneously turned to liquid nitrogen and then shattered. He gasped, a sound swallowed quickly by the club's background noise, but loud enough to register in the sudden vacuum of his personal space. His eyes widened, fixing on her face, searching for the effort, the strain, the aggressive twist that would explain the instantaneous, paralyzing agony. He found nothing. Her face was blank. Her eyes were still the color of lake ice. Her body remained relaxed, almost serene. She hadn't moved an inch, except for the precise, clinical application of biomechanics that had just rendered his dominant hand useless. He tried to pull away, to wrench his hand free from what felt like a delicate, unbreakable manacle, but her grip, if you could even call it a grip, it was more like a perfect application of leverage, held him suspended, locked in excruciating stasis. He realized with a sickening lurch that she was holding him captive with no visible effort. The entire club, the music, the laughter, it all receded, replaced by the ringing alarm bells in his nervous system. His breathing became shallow, rapid. The expensive alcohol in his blood turned to lead. She leaned in slightly, closing the minimal distance between them. The scent of cold scotch on her sweater mixed with something else, something faintly metallic and dry, like old gunpowder clinging to cloth, or perhaps simply the sheer unnerving coldness of her skin. Her lips barely moved as she spoke. The sound was not a shout, not a demand, not even a threat. It was a dry, textureless whisper, delivered with the mechanical neutrality of a secure transmission protocol. "Lieutenant Commander Thorne." She used his full rank, an instant violation of the informal club environment. "You have compromised my cover and interfered with an ongoing mission profile." His eyes pleaded for clarification, for escape, but she offered none. She tightened the pressure point infinitesimally, a microscopic adjustment that ratcheted the pain from shocking to unbearable. A thin sheen of cold sweat broke out on his forehead, glistening under the dim lights. Then came the code. "The parameters are simple. You cease immediate physical contact and identify yourself to the assigned liaison. Failure to comply results in complete non-lethal incapacitation and immediate status revocation." She paused, letting the silence swallow the procedural threat. Then she delivered the two words that, in certain deep, black corners of the special operations community, possessed the crushing weight of absolute authority and terrifying history. She exhaled the code directly into his ear, her voice a dry, rasping sound that bypassed his auditory nerves and went straight to the core of his survival instincts. Viper 1. The name hung in the dense air like a spectral executioner. It wasn't a code word, she realized with a sickening twist in his stomach. It was a call sign. A name whispered only by those who had survived the things that names like that represented. Viper 1. The call sign was apocryphal. It was a ghost story told in the deepest, most secure briefing rooms. The designation given to the mythical, untraceable operative unit responsible for the operations that officially never happened. The ones that went so far beyond the boundaries of standard doctrine that they were archived only in the deepest secure drives, often without rank or name attached. Only the classification, Viper, and the lead operator. 1. Thorne's face, usually flushed with the self-satisfaction of his rank, went profoundly, terrifyingly pale. All the blood drained away, leaving his skin the color of wet chalk. He wasn't just afraid of pain, he was afraid of recognition. He was realizing with horrifying clarity that the anonymous, soft-sweatered civilian he had just manhandled was the mythological weapon his entire command structure occasionally spoke about, in hushed, reverent, and deeply fearful tones. He knew the legend. Viper 1 wasn't a person, it was an outcome. It meant the mission was critical, the methods were brutal, and the collateral damage, especially to those who got in the way, was irrelevant. He tried to whisper an apology, a retraction, anything, but the paralyzing lock on his hand stole his breath. And then, the club's atmosphere shifted again, decisively. The transition was signaled not by a crash or a sound, but by the cessation of all background chatter. The low thrum of the jazz track suddenly seemed incredibly, insultingly loud. Everyone in the immediate vicinity, other officers, high-ranking executives, several other off-duty SEALs, had simultaneously frozen, their expressions moving from casual conversation to a state of rigid military attention. They weren't looking at Thorne. They were looking at the entrance of the main bar area just behind him. Into the space stepped General Marcus Kratos. Kratos was not just a general. He was an institution, a 4-star veteran of 4 conflicts, the current Joint Chief of Staff for Unconventional Warfare, and, incidentally, the quiet owner of the Crucible Club. He was an enormous man, radiating coiled power even in a civilian blazer, his face a roadmap of hard-won battles and sleepless nights. Kratos hadn't been looking at the altercation, but he had heard the silence. The subtle, specific silence that happens when a low-ranking officer is about to commit professional suicide in front of witnesses. His eyes scanned the room, bypassing the loud red-faced Thorne and landing directly on the gray-sweatered woman in the corner. His expression, which moments before had been one of tired satisfaction, immediately cracked, replaced by a look of shock, followed instantly by a deference so profound it was almost worshipful. Kratos did not blink. He saw the immobilized lieutenant commander, the small cold hand holding the massive man in check, and the dark wet stain spreading on the irreplaceable sweater. Kratos took 2 long strides, placing him directly behind Thorne. Thorne, unable to move his hand and still suspended in exquisite agony, tried to twist around, sensing the presence of the general. Kratos ignored him completely. His gaze was fixed on Silva. "Sergeant," Kratos said, his voice dropping from the general's commanding rumble to the low, respectful tone reserved only for heads of state or those whose operational achievements dwarfed his own medals. He used her actual, lower rank, Sergeant Silva, a detail that made the blood run colder in Thorne's veins. It was the rank she held, not the authority she wielded. Silva released the pressure point on Thorne's hand. The lieutenant commander stumbled back instantly, clutching his hand to his chest, whimpering slightly, looking utterly ruined. The agonizing electric shock subsided, replaced by a profound, trembling weakness. He looked down at his own hand. It appeared perfectly normal, but it felt dead, useless, betrayed by its own nervous system. He finally saw the general, who stood less than a foot away. Thorne snapped to attention instantly, despite the pain, his entire body rigid with fear and respect. General, sir," Thorne stammered, attempting a salute with his functional hand, a pitiful gesture. General Kratos didn't return the salute. He didn't even look at Thorne. His attention remained entirely focused on Sergeant Silva, who was now calmly gathering the remains of her ruined book. Kratos reached out a hand, not to console Thorne, but to gently guide the lieutenant commander entirely out of the way, moving him with the casual ease one might use to rearrange a sandbag. Then, the general performed the unthinkable. He walked over to the main bar, took an impeccably clean, fresh highball glass, and selected a bottle of Glenfiddich 50-year reserve, a bottle kept specifically for the general and valued at over $15,000. He poured a modest measure, ensuring the ice was crystal clear and untouched. General Kratos, 4-star general, chairman of the Unconventional Operations Oversight, brought the fresh drink back to the table, walking around the shattered Thorne. He placed the glass gently, deliberately, on the coaster in front of Sergeant Silva. "My profound apologies, Sergeant Silva," Kratos stated, the word sergeant sounding like commander-in-chief coming from his mouth, "for the interruption and the damage to your assets. There are disciplinary matters to attend to." He paused, glancing briefly at the ruined book, then back at her face, reading the silent command in her eyes. "The book," Kratos added, his voice low. "I will have a first edition replacement secured and delivered by morning, and regarding the uniform, there will be an immediate change of command. Effective immediately. Lieutenant Commander Thorne will be reporting to the sanitation detail in the Aleutians. He will clean the barracks until the stain of his negligence is, shall we say, removed." Thorne choked. The Aleutians? Sanitation detail? His career wasn't just over, it was being buried under frozen dirt. All because of a spilled scotch and a wrist she had merely brushed. He finally understood. He hadn't just insulted a civilian. He had crossed the boundary of a sacred operational theater. He had laid a clumsy, drunken hand on a national asset, a weapon of such strategic importance that a 4-star general was now running interference and serving her drinks. He looked at Silva again. The lighting suddenly seemed sharper. Her gray eyes weren't just cold. They held an immense, incomprehensible distance. The gaze of someone who had watched things burn in the deep dark and come back utterly unmarked. He finally saw the operative beneath the reader, the economy of movement, the terrifying stillness, the absolute surgical precision of her silent threat. He realized she hadn't stopped him because he was rude. She had stopped him because he was contaminating her profile. He was trash. She was the ghost that haunted the halls of power. Silva acknowledged the general's extraordinary display of subservience with a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was acceptance, not thanks. She reached for the clean glass of expensive scotch. She didn't drink it. She picked up the discarded lime wedge from her water glass and placed it carefully into the highball. Then she stood. Her movement was fluid, effortless, rising from the deep banquette without ever leaning on her hands or exhibiting any strain. It was the rise of a spring trap being released. She was taller than he had registered, and the cold efficiency radiated off her like heat from a stove. She did not look at Thorne again. He stood trembling, utterly forgotten, the physical manifestation of his ruined career. Silva straightened her sweater, ignoring the wet stain, and walked past the general. Kratos, the general, the commander of thousands, stood rigid, his massive frame held in a formal military posture, watching her go. He didn't salute. That would break her cover entirely. But the respect in his stance was a physical echo of 100 salutes. The music swelled slightly as she neared the door, but the sound seemed to bow out of her way. The other patrons, recognizing the silent seismic power shift that had occurred, averted their eyes, careful not to even brush her shadow. She passed through the heavy mahogany doors, leaving the Crucible Club, the smell of scotch, the weight of the brass, and the wreckage of Lieutenant Commander Thorne behind her. The only sound remaining was the faint, lingering echo of two whispered words, cold and absolute. "Viper One." The silence in the club was a dense, suffocating blanket. Thorne stood there, holding his useless hand, watching the spot where she had been, realizing that he had just signed his own operational death warrant, not with a failing mission report, but with a spilled drink. He had been measured, weighed, and found utterly, tragically wanting by the standard bearer of the elite. He had sought rank, but encountered mastery. General Kratos finally turned to face the decimated officer, his expression hard, heavy, and devoid of sympathy. The general merely pointed toward the door. Thorne didn't need further orders. He turned and shuffled out, knowing that the stench of spilled scotch would forever cling to his uniform. She had already gone. If you believe respect is earned by blood and not by rank, type respect in the comments.